Hello, people. My name is Marshall Gregory Thomas. A few Army intelligence officers are using classified anti-personnel weapons in a secret, dirty war of torture and assassination, targeting innocent men, women, and even children. Most victims are political activists and whistleblowers, being used as human guinea pigs to perfect classified weapons in a classified weapons development program. The active denial system, the ADS, is a public non-lethal microwave weapon that instantly heats your skin to 130 degrees Fahrenheit and feels like you are touching a red hot frying pan. It is a pain amplification device engineered not to kill, so the public will accept the new weapons. The political activists and whistleblowers are being targeted, attacked in their homes and places of work with similar weapons. These weapons deliver non-ionizing radiation that heats up their bodies, and they'll eventually die from heart attack or cancer or become forced suicides to escape the endless torture. A few military intelligence officers, General John B. Alexander, Lieutenant Colonel, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, and others associated with the 704th Military Intelligence Brigade are allegedly using classified anti-personnel weapons to target potential enemies and anyone who might attempt to stop them. The case being made here is based upon 4 facts. This is to avoid confusion, disinformation, and circular arguments that lead nowhere. MK took place at over 80 institutions, and the current program that the author calls Monarch is equally complex. 4 facts are all that's necessary to convince a reasonable person this atrocity is really taking place. The name Monarch has been chosen by the author. The real name is unknown. Fact 1. Electromagnetic weapons, like the ADS, the active denial system, are public microwave weapons systems. The Russians used electromagnetic weapons to attack the U.S. Embassy in Moscow in the 1950s. In response, the U.S. began to develop microwave weapons in a secret crash program at government weapons laboratories. Fact 2. A criminal history. A prior pattern of criminal behavior. 500,000 U.S. citizens used as human guinea pigs in nuclear, biological, chemical weapons development programs. COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, government hit list of political activists, and MKUltra behavior modification experiments using torture to break the human mind to control it. All 3 of these illegal government programs, the human guinea pig experiments, COINTELPRO, and MKUltra, all 3 programs escaped detection for decades, for generations. No one was ever caught. No one was ever punished. Fact 3. Credible witnesses have testified that they are targets of classified electromagnetic weapons and vigilante violence known as organized stalking. The author has personally interviewed 200 individuals in person. Most of these targeted individuals are political activists and whistleblowers, people who have sought political reform, people who have called out corruption within powerful government agencies and private corporations. The average targeted individual is about 40 years old with a high IQ, and they share other common traits, other commonalities. The majority fit a common profile similar to victims of previous illegal government programs. Fact 4. Persons of interest in Army intelligence. Army intelligence officers who have worked since 1980 to develop electromagnetic weapons for the Army. They've publicly expressed admiration for MKUltra. They've expressed interest in using these weapons to, quote, neuter people. And they've advocated using electromagnetic weapons to attack civilians in their own homes. And they've helped move these classified military weapons over from the Department of Defense over the Department of Justice to be used by into the hands of local law enforcement. Finally, these borderline personalities promote borderline beliefs and superstitions as part of a smokescreen cover-up. These are the basic facts, reduced to the bare minimum. More evidence is free online in books and films titled Monarch, the New Phoenix Program, as well as government documents, military science papers, scientific papers, patents, authoritative newspaper, magazine articles, books, films, and the testimony of experts and witnesses. 4 facts is all that's necessary to prove a preponderance of evidence sufficient to convince a reasonable person these crimes are taken. A preponderance of evidence enough sufficient to convince a reasonable person that these crimes are taking place and must be stopped. This is the civil case, not a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt. A civil case applied uses the yardstick of what a reasonable person would expect to be true. Okay, so the 4 facts, just very briefly. The weapons exist. This is not up for discussion. This is part of the historical record. The Russians attacked the U.S. Embassy in Moscow with microwave weapons from the 1950s until the 1970s, and they got away with it. Okay, this is documented history. No, we haven't seen what these weapons look like, even from the 1950s. And this is almost the exact same type of weapons system that is being used today. All right, fact 2, the criminal history. This is historical record. Human guinea pig experiments, 500,000 Americans used as human guinea pigs. This is historical record. This is the government's own numbers and testimony. Okay, COINTELPRO, hit list of political activists. MK Ultra, using torture, various levels of torture, one on top of the other, used to break down and destroy the human mind in order to control it. These are all part of the historical record. This is not up for grabs, okay? This is not a question, all right? Fact 3 are the credible witnesses. Now, these witnesses are in evidence. These people have come forward publicly. You know, I've gone out and contacted these people and met with them personally, 200 individuals. I have satisfied myself to their veracity. I've seen evidence of the vigilante violence and evidence of classified weapons being used on their persons. Okay, you don't have to take my word for it. People are going to say that all these people are crazy. The only thing that is not proven is whether these people are telling the truth or whether it's a case of mass hysteria and delusion of hundreds and several thousands of individuals. But these people who are saying this, who are testifying to this, do exist. That is not in question. The only question is, can we prove whether somebody's telling the truth or lying? We're going to prove somebody's sane or crazy. Okay. That's the only thing, that's the only jump ball here. All right. These people exist. All right. Fact 4, persons of interest in Army intelligence. These are borderline personalities. They've written books. They've written military science papers. They've given newspaper interviews and said these things publicly about admiring these previous war crimes. It's documented. They've been in charge of developing these weapons for the Army, these classified weapons development programs, in charge of these programs since 1980. So, and we're talking about generational, training new officers to come on board and to develop and utilize these weapon systems. We're talking about the 704th Military Intelligence Brigade Headquarters Unit. We're talking about previous military intelligence officers who are retired. Well, you don't retire from the mafia and you don't retire from the intelligence services. Okay, there's no such thing. All right, those are the 4 facts, and the only thing that is up for discussion really is whether this is a case of mass hysteria and all these people all went crazy, at the same time, or whether they're telling the truth, like previous groups of experimental subjects, just like going back to 1943. Okay, this human experimentation to develop nuclear biological and chemical weapons using unknowing Americans as human guinea pigs. This is a feature not just of the Manhattan Project from 1943. This is a feature all through American history, Army Chemical Corps, CIA, of doing these experiments, operating these programs. Okay, this is part of the historical record. All right, these are the basic facts reduced to their bare minimum. Now, when the Russians attacked the U.S. Embassy in Moscow with microwave weapons in the 1950s, the U.S. began to develop microwave weapons in secret. Today, there are public non-lethal microwave weapons like the active denial system, milliwave radars, see-through wall radars. But where are the weapons that kill? We have not seen these weapons. Okay, this is imperative. The Russians developed microwave weapons that can kill by stopping the heart or causing cancer. If the United States had developed lethal microwave weapons capabilities and kept them secret because what if the American people saw that human beings killed by heart attack or cancer, they might object to these very sophisticated, very capable weapons as immoral and dangerous. The Russians attacked the U.S. Embassy in the 1950s with electromagnetic weapons and kept it secret until the 1970s. So the Russians could get away with using electromagnetic weapons against the United States. Even back then, the 1950s through the 70s, the most powerful superpower in the world. If the Russians can get away with it for 20 years, practically, what chance would a single individual have against this kind of state-sponsored terrorism? High-tech terrorism. The Russians had electromagnetic weapons for decades that can kill goats at a distance of half a mile. Okay, were the Russians the only ones smart enough to develop electromagnetic weapons? Innocent people are being attacked every day with electromagnetic weapons in their homes and workplaces. They are living a terroristic nightmare that can scarcely be imagined. Uh, the attacks employ a decoy and deception strategy, so it's impossible to tell exactly who is attacking you and exactly how they're attacking you. If these weapons were public, if these electromagnetic weapons were public, like the ones used on the United States diplomats in Moscow for almost 20 years, if these weapons were public, you might begin to believe these people. As it is, they stand no chance whatsoever. The active denial system shoots a tight beam of electromagnetic radiation in the 95 gigahertz range that heats up your skin to 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Feels like you're touching a red-hot frying pan. It is a pain amplification device engineered not to kill so the public will accept the new weapons system. Now, during the Cold War, the U.S. Army used 500,000 U.S. citizens as guinea pigs for nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons development. It's only logical that the next greatest thing, they're going to continue the same behavior. Electromagnetic weapons are the latest and greatest toys coming out of these government weapons labs. Do you think they just suddenly stopped at the end of the Cold War? If they could continue without getting caught, wouldn't they be tempted to continue? If a murderer, an example, one person, if a murderer had tortured and killed 500,000 people and got away with it, and then one day you gave this person, him, an electromagnetic weapon that could kill anyone, anywhere, without the risk of getting caught, what would he do? Would he just stop out of some newfound sense of morality and love of humanity? If the U.S. had weapons that could kill anyone, anywhere, without leaving any physical evidence and only a select few individuals knew of their existence, wouldn't they be tempted to use them for their own selfish purposes? The power to kill anyone is an absolute power that corrupts absolutely. If the intelligence agencies, have a history of criminal behavior targeting political activists and whistleblowers, and the current targets are political activists and whistleblowers who testify that they are being attacked with classified anti-personnel weapons similar to the active denial system, shouldn't these intelligence agencies, military intelligence, be investigated? When the KGB whistleblower, KGB, Alexander Litvinenko, was poisoned with polonium-210, there was a radiation trail that led from Moscow to London, where they poisoned the former spy and KGB whistleblower, and then back again. You could trace the polonium-210 contamination onto the plane, into the hotels, into restaurants, trains, cars. Okay, there was an undeniable radiation trail. that led from Moscow to London and back to Moscow. When a targeted individual is murdered using non-ionizing radiation to induce heart attack, stroke, or cancer, there is no physical evidence of foul play. No traces of nuclear agents, biological, chemical agents, residues. A murder that is plausibly deniable is the perfect crime. Investigative reporters have corroborated these charges independently. JSOC, Joint Special Operations Command, has a secret weapon, a revolutionary breakthrough in electronic warfare capabilities that will transform how war is waged. They possess a secret weapon that can track and kill anyone in their area of operations, day or night, in any weather. JSOC has a death squad with a hit list, carrying out assassinations outside the chain of military command or civilian oversight. These are the same charges, basic charges, made by political activists and whistleblowers, that they are targeted with classified anti-personnel weapons similar to the active denial system. Now, electromagnetic weapons are referred to as a revolution in military affairs, RMA. RMA is a very specific terminology used by military scientists. This is a military science term. Revolution in military affairs. Examples of RMA, previous RMA, are the invention of gunpowder and the invention of nuclear weapons. The invention of gunpowder meant that all previous weapons that came before are suddenly obsolete, and a few hundred men armed with cannons and firearms can basically take over entire countries, turning the political, economic, social, military structure upside down. If the Nazis had invented nuclear weapons in 1940 and had a dozen atomic bombs, they could have taken over the entire world and put in place a fascist state world government and ruled the entire world armed with nuclear weapons as an RMA. Hernan Cortez landed in Veracruz, Mexico in 1521 with approximately 500 men, several hundred horses, several cannons, small cannons, primitive flintlock firearms, steel body armor, and steel swords and helmets. Okay. Armed with this RMA, gunpowder, essentially, and 500 men, in the space of 80 battles, he defeated the most powerful military force in the entire Western Hemisphere. Hundreds, literally tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of warriors, using this revolution in military affairs, and destroyed the Aztec city, which is now Mexico City. Okay. In 1521, when he landed, there were approximately 20 million individuals, native inhabitants of Mexico and associated tribes. 20 years later, after the conquest of Mexico, the indigenous population had crashed to 2 million souls. This is the nature of what it means to lose the arms race and to be on the receiving end of a revolution in military affairs. This is very serious. Today's battlefield weapons are shells and missiles that travel at top speeds of around 3,000, 2,000, 3,000 miles per hour. Electromagnetic weapons and lasers travel at the speed of light, 186,000 miles a second. They have demonstrated the ability to destroy shells and missiles in flight with these directed energy weapons. We are living in the age of an RMA. But who controls this RMA? The people who have been in charge of developing these weapons since 1980 have been using these weapons on innocent American citizens, literally by the thousands, and getting away with it for years. Is this merely experimental stage, or are these borderline personalities prepared to use the new RMA on the larger population? With what aims? The Department of Defense doesn't want a public backlash against weapons they're pouring billions of dollars into. These electromagnetic weapons are the perfect tool for espionage, psyops. They're very versatile, cheaper than other weapon systems. You get more bang for the buck. These electromagnetic weapons will never willingly be made public or given up by Army intelligence. The intelligence agencies still keep the formula for like 100 years of invisible ink secret. This formula for invisible ink was kept secret for 100 years. They are not giving up these classified weapons. Department of Defense physicists have developed electromagnetic weapons that couple with and interact with the human central nervous system without electrodes from a distance. Many scientific papers written in the 50s, 60s, and 70s have been classified retroactively in the 90s, but many scientific papers still remain public. There are voluminous public patents for these weapons that both interact with and attack the central nervous system. Today, the private sector is reinventing the wheel, independent of the Department of Defense. Similar technology is being used for the disabled. Toyota, for instance, makes a wheelchair that quadriplegics can control with mental commands. Electromagnetic fields, weapons, or in this case, devices, coupling subtly with the human central nervous system at a distance outside the human body. There are persons of interest in charge of non-lethal microwave weapons development for the Army since the 1980s, working at weapons labs like Los Alamos National Laboratory, where the atomic bomb was invented in secret. These men have expressed admiration for MKUltra and advocated using these weapons to modify human behavior and, quote, neuter people. These are public declarations and interviews in newspapers, on television. They've publicly advocated, using electromagnetic weapons to attack civilians in their own homes in scientific military science papers. Okay, these persons of interest are not insane. They are borderline personalities. But these are highly capable, highly intelligent individuals. These are experts with 45 years experience typically in psychological warfare operations and counterinsurgency warfare, such as the Phoenix program. Remote viewing. Remote viewing is sold online by Army intelligence officers from a private company, in effect saying, give us your credit card and for several thousands of dollars, we'll teach you superpowers of the mind so you can spy on the Russians in their underground bases or find their submarines hidden at the bottom of the ocean. Should we believe them, or should we look more closely to see if there's something else going on here? None of these intelligence officers, none of these government physicists, mad scientists, intelligence officers, spies, none of these individuals actually believe in in remote viewing, perhaps, allegedly. None of these individuals, spies, mad scientists, in charge of developing classified weapons for Army intelligence, none of these individuals believe in apocalyptic death cults, allegedly. These alleged superstitions are probably a smokescreen. Superstitions, apocalyptic death cults, don't go together with classified Army weapons development programs. One of these things does not belong with the other. They do go together with the concept of the big lie used as a smokescreen. The big lie was first used for the World War II D-Day invasion. Army intelligence created a fake army around General George Patton to mislead the enemy with fake radio traffic, even inflatable tanks, inflatable planes, fake landing craft. The Nazi high command was so fooled by this fake imaginary army that even weeks after the Normandy invasions and D-Day, they're still holding their Panzer tank divisions in reserve, waiting for the real army, the imaginary army to invade, the real invasion to take place at Calais. The big lie was used to cover up the real operation of 8,000 ships and 250,000 men. It is misdirection on a mass scale to screen a secret plan, to screen, in effect, a large-scale military operation. Now, it's important to understand what we're dealing with. J. Edgar Hoover had files on congressmen and presidents that detailed their personal lives, made them afraid to fire him. The FBI targeted political activists and COINTELPRO. Hoover personally wrote a letter to MLK, a letter to force him to commit suicide. Hoover's career stretched from even before the 20s up until the 70s when he died in office. This was unprecedented for one man to control one of the world's most powerful agencies in government for so long. I mean, this kind of power that we're faced with is men too powerful to defy, too powerful to cross, or even a congressman or even presidents might be politically or otherwise physically destroyed. Anyone who commands the power to assassinate people in a manner that appears to be a natural cause of death is able to get away with murder. It's the perfect crime. This capability is exactly what we're faced with today. The ability, to kill anyone with plausible deniability. If Hoover had access to electromagnetic weapons, he would have used them on people like Dr. Martin Luther King. He would have used them on MLK. You would have read one day in the newspaper that the late Dr. King had died of a heart attack suddenly. He had died of a stroke. He had died of cancer, or perhaps he'd even committed suicide. The late Dr. King's movement would have stalled out and died out before it had gained sufficient momentum within society to succeed if Hoover had access to electromagnetic weapons. The motivation to assassinate loyal American opposition stems from perception of dissent against the Vietnam War as treason. This philosophy is stated very clearly in the Mind War paper, written by Army Intelligence Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. The claim of sabotage by domestic enemies as a reason for losing the Vietnam War was once a borderline view, but is now the premier narrative of the neocons. This claim of betrayal is the exact same claim made by the German army after their loss in World War I. German military leaders blamed socialists, communists, and the Jews who stabbed them in the back on the home front. Army intelligence officers with hard right-wing views are following the well-worn path of blaming their political opponents with treason and using that as an excuse to eliminate them. To understand the current program that I call Monarch, it's necessary to understand COINTELPRO and MKUltra, the previous illegal government programs. COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, targeted the civil rights movement, anti-war movement, environmental movement, women's movement, infiltration and psychological operations probably began about in the 1950s. The theory of counterinsurgency warfare operations dictates that infiltration and psyops be used against dissident groups during normal times, during peacetime, before any mass movement can develop. This means an undeclared war must be waged on civil society, namely people trying to legally bring about change, social change, in a lawful and constitutionally protected manner. Favorite FBI tactic is the snitch jacket, where suspicion of being an informant is used against legitimate leaders. In practice, an FBI informant would join Dr. King's, MLK's inner circle and use false evidence, documents, recordings, etc., to make it appear that Dr. King was himself an FBI informant. The organization is torn apart by suspicion and broken apart from within. FBI agents at the same time pressure the landlords to evict the political activists in the organization and pressure their employers to fire them so that they lose their home and their job and their organization all at the same time. COINTELPRO went silent in the late 70s and then reemerged again in the early 1980s. Infiltration of anti-war groups is a common part of the current global war on terror. MKUltra. The CIA scientists, Dr. Sidney Gottlieb, used Nazi scientists, and their state-of-the-art mind control techniques perfected in concentration camps of World War II. Nazi scientists experimented on children using drugs, torture, electroshock, and hypnosis. Mind control works best when the trauma is administered by the age of 3. Trauma causes the personality to split or dissociate. In order to shield the mind from memories too painful to endure, the mind itself might be destroyed. It works like the partitioning of a computer hard drive. The Three Faces of Eve is a true story of a woman's multiple personality disorder accidentally created by childhood abuse. Trauma causes the dissociation, the splitting. MKUltra works best when the trauma is repeated on the child at 6 years of age. Later, the child's IQ and personality tests determine if the child may be trained in espionage and used for espionage operations. The subject can be hypnotized and used for operations, after which they have no memory, conscious memory of events, and only consciously aware of a sense of lost time. They are like a sleepwalker who remembers nothing. The current illegal programs using electromagnetic weapons to traumatize targets is a direct result of these earlier illegal government programs, the human guinea pig experiments, COINTELPRO and MKUltra. Now, government elites are effectively above the law due to the National Security Act, NSA, of 1947, which allows claims of national security exceptions in courts of law to cover up criminal wrongdoing. Judges accept the argument, trust us or our enemies will learn our secrets. Wearing the uniform of the U.S. government, the United States Army, doesn't mean men stop being human and thus imperfect. The NSA, the National Security Act, was first invoked in court in 1953 when a B-29 B-29 crashed, killing the civilians aboard. Their widows sued for negligence. The DoD invoked the NSA, National Security Act, 1947, and the court records were sealed. 50 years later, the records were unsealed. There were no secrets to protect, only DoD negligence. This was the first time the NSA was used in court, and the pattern is repeated to allow the Department of Defense and others in the executive to avoid criminal penalties. It is the perfect get-out-of-jail-free card. In World War I, the U.S. Army created its first formal intelligence service, the Military Intelligence Division, in 1917, the MID. The MID was small but multiplied its force using an unofficial army of 250,000 vigilantes called the American Protective League, the APL. The vigilante army was used to suppress anti-war activities and to keep watch over suspicious activities. Leaders of the vigilante army were made official officers in the MID. Targeted individuals currently are victims of organized stalking. Other terms are gang stalking, street theater, gaslighting. The KKK called it mobbing. Targeted individuals are victims of a public smear campaign to cast them as criminals, undesirable elements who must be driven out of the community. The vigilante means of driving TIs out of town are low-level attacks, some of which are not technically illegal and are difficult for the target to describe to other people. Strangers coming up and cursing the targeted individual in public everywhere they go, bumping into them on purpose, bumping and blocking tactics on inside stores or on the sidewalks, city streets. Total strangers start verbal arguments or even physical fistfights. Forced car wrecks, people pulling out in front and slamming on their brakes, or simply ramming your car in parking lots, that kind of thing. Forced car wrecks. Constant break-ins. Systematic break-ins into your home, vandalism of your possessions, sabotage of computer, systematic harassment at work, and noise campaigns. Noise campaigns such as neighbors next door blasting music all night, every night. A symphony of systemic, low-level attacks that occur literally a dozen times a day or more. And after just a few weeks of this kind of constant repetition of attacks, the stress level of the target is pegged at an artificially high level. The person begins to lose physical energy, sleep patterns are altered, depression sets in, work output drops to near zero. These tactics were learned during the Cold War to use against Russian spies in order to neutralize them in place so they wouldn't be replaced. They would just have zero work output because they're not sleeping and they're not able to deal with the constant attacks. So this constant level of attacks causing psychological trauma might be termed the death of 1,000 cuts. These tactics are similar to the behavioral science consultation teams, the BISCUIT teams, that tailor PSYOP attacks designed by a doctor, psychologist, and interrogation specialist to individually design a campaign targeting cultural and personality weaknesses of the detainee. BISCUIT teams use many small stress factors applied one on top of the other, used over time. These include isolation, extreme temperature, extreme cold, stress positions, constant lights on or lights off to distort the time sense, sleep and sensory deprivation, sound attacks, blasting loud noises, sexual humiliation, constant threats of violence to the detainee or their families, even unpleasant odors and other techniques, all used over time, one on top of the other, to slowly break down and psychologically neutralize and destroy the subject, the human, without resorting to traditional torture such as electrocution of the genitals or pulling out fingernails. Um, it's difficult to get a grasp of how effective these techniques are. If you take laboratory animals, hamsters, and you blast noise above a certain decibel level, after a couple of weeks of this, the animals will spontaneously fall over and die. Okay, that's one aspect. Um, People who go without sleep for more than 2 or 3 days begin to have auditory hallucinations. They start hearing things. Um, so. Uh, Isolation. Typically, the Chinese communists would isolate Korean prisoners of war, American prisoners of war in the Korean War, pardon me. And after 2 weeks of constant isolation, you began to psychologically break down and spontaneously begin to cry, or or, or cry out, or you reach your breaking point. In other words, so all these techniques used one on top of the other. A person who undergoes sensory deprivation begins to spontaneously hallucinate after you know merely a few hours, less than a few hours. So these are incredibly powerful techniques. The Russians by the 1960s. Where did we get all this? The Russians by the 1960s. Hint, hint. Uh, they were worried about world opinion. They couldn't openly imprison their political dissidents and then execute them in Lubyanka prison like they previously had, or continue to utilize the gulag to the degree they had. They began forced institutionalization of dissidents into mental hospitals and forced them to take powerful experimental drugs in order to destroy them mentally. The 1972 U.S. Army study, Controlled Offensive Behavior, runs to about 100 pages. This 1972 U.S. Army study of the Russians' behavior, scientific torture, was an in-depth study of non-traditional torture techniques and tools used by the Soviet Union, the USSR, on their political dissidents. The topics of study included use of isolation, the use of temperature, light, sound, smell, sleep and sensory deprivation, fake firing squads, and the use of electromagnetic weapons to target their political dissidents as well. Okay. The techniques and the weapons were used to break down minds and behavior modification experiments to turn political dissidents, Russian political dissidents, into psychiatric cases. The U.S. has now adopted the weapons and techniques of our former communist enemies in the current global war on terror and in the secret dirty war on political activists and whistleblowers. Now, it's inevitable that the targeted individuals will be called crazy and explained away as mass hysteria. This often happened to human guinea pigs in the past. Both COINTELPRO and MKUltra used the strategy of making the targets look crazy as a primary method for keeping the illegal government operations secret. The human radiation experiments exposed thousands of citizens, U.S. citizens, to harmful or lethal levels of radiation. This is one man's story out of 500,000 in 1947. Mr. Elmer Allen was injected with plutonium in the left leg in a San Francisco hospital, and the next day his leg was amputated. He told his best friends and his family doctor back home in Italy, Texas, that he thought he might have been used as a human guinea pig. His friend didn't believe him and avoided him after that, and his doctor permanently classified him as a paranoid schizophrenic in his medical records. Mr. Allen's family didn't find out the truth until years after his death. In 1995, the U.S. government decided to go public. It held hearings and issued a report, but no one was punished. The hearings functioned as a whitewash. COINTELPRO targets were routinely depicted as paranoid when they claimed that the government was systematically following them, harassing them, sabotaging their lives. Anti-war activist Abby Hoffman told press, the family, friends, that he was being targeted systematically by the government in a surreptitious manner. But these people who knew him, most of them, refused to believe him. Afterwards, they avoided him. Like-minded individuals broke into FBI offices, stole government FBI documents that proved the FBI was spending half of its time on COINTELPRO. 40% of its resources went to the counterintelligence program of targeting these political activists. It was only then that some members of the press began to believe Abby Hoffman. MKUltra survivors still live in fear in the shadows even today. If the victims tell a doctor or therapist that as children they were drugged and tortured in government labs to induce multiple personality disorder, they will be permanently classified as paranoid schizophrenics in their medical records. This keeps the worst aspects of MKUltra a secret. Even today, many of the victims report receiving threats and harassment when they attempt to give public testimony about what's happened to them when they were kids. MKUltra was designed and run by allegedly government-funded psychiatrists such as, allegedly, Ewan Cameron, former head of the American and World Psychiatric Association. He was the most powerful psychiatrist in the world. Current victims of Monarch will be smeared as tinfoil hat mass hysteria cases because many previous victims of illegal government programs have suffered the same fate. To say that can't happen here, something this big can't be kept secret, is untrue because all the previous illegal government programs involving 500,000 victims, 500,000 people, happened here. They were kept secret for decades. The Department of Defense used 500,000 human guinea pigs for weapons development programs without interruption from 1943 until 1995 without it becoming public knowledge. COINTELPRO waged war against political activism from the 1950s onwards. MKUltra traumatized children from 1953, probably before then, until well into the late 1970s. The atrocities continued for generations, completely off the public radar. No one ever went to jail. MKUltra is still largely an unknown. And since the hearings exposed only the tip of the iceberg of the atrocities committed, the victims have been largely intimidated into silence. If the full truth ever came out that the CIA systematically tortured children in government laboratories, their reputations would never recover. Demands for airtight proof are impossible to meet as long as perpetrators are able to use the National Security Act of 1947 in court. The only way airtight proof can be obtained is to break into Fort Meade Army Intelligence Headquarters and steal government documents. Even this might not work. Activists broke into FBI offices, stole COINTELPRO documents that led to multiple congressional hearings and investigations, but no one went to jail. COINTELPRO went dark for a few years and then reemerged again in the early 1980s. Demand for airtight proof is unreasonable and impossible under the circumstances. We might as well demand spontaneous confessions by mass murderers. Rattlesnakes don't commit suicide. You have to chop off their heads. This case presents sufficient evidence of criminal activity, crimes against humanity. The weapons are proven to exist. There's a prior pattern of criminal behavior. These are not up for investigation. This is part of the public record, historical fact. Credible witnesses testified. Persons of interest are named who have developed the microwave weapons. They've written about the weapons. They've advocated using the weapons. They've given the weapons to law enforcement. They participated in a smokescreen, allegedly. In view of similar programs in the past that went undiscovered, unpunished, a different strategy is necessary. So, this case rises to the level of a civil case. This case presents sufficient circumstantial evidence, a critical mass, sufficient to convince a reasonable person that these crimes against humanity are really happening. It is unrealistic to expect that we can break into Army Intelligence headquarters, steal government documents, and prove that this is actually happening. But these classified weapons development programs are perpetrating these crimes against humanity. We need government hearings. We need a blue ribbon commission. We need to make these weapons public now. This case is based on 4 facts. Evil men are hiding crimes against humanity behind the door of classification. If the 4 facts add up, if it adds up to 4, open the door. Make the weapons public. Show us the photographs. Show us these classified weapons that are being used. In the past, were used against the United States Embassy in Moscow, and that are being used today to target political activists and whistleblowers. Once again, this is Marshall Gregory Thomas here with the 28th Amendment. And thank you for your patience. Thank you for your attention. And we're going to pursue this further. This is systemic. This isn't just one or two people. This is, a process institutionalized since 1943, since the Manhattan Project. So what we have with the electromagnetic weapons is a mini Manhattan Project all to its own. It's been going on since the early 70s, or probably before then, when we discovered that the Russians were using these weapons against our embassy in Moscow. It is a primary feature of the Cold War, that of the arms race itself, that once one side had developed a certain weapon system, the other side was forced to also to match this or exceed it with a similar or a better similar weapon system, either by stealing the technology or independently developing this weapons technology itself. Often the United States would, to develop new weapon systems and to explore new ideas, would publish publicly that the Russians had developed and had perfected a certain kind of weapon system, and this was a way of garnering funds and research activity to develop entire new classes of weapons. So these weapons exist, and we have the witnesses, and we have named individuals, borderline personalities, who are allegedly involved in criminal activity and must be investigated. And this criminal history, the past is prologue. So what we're going to do is we're going to institute the 28th Amendment as a massive reform on our political system, and then we're going to make sure that this constant feature of the American system, human experimentation, that violates the Nuremberg Code, we're going to make sure that what has been going on since 1943 never happens again. Once again, thank you so much for your support, and I hope you'll take the time to go online and read further. This is Monarch, the New Phoenix Program, the author, Marshall Gregory Thomas. And when you see the one world eye, the cosmic eye here, that's our trademark, so you know you're in the right place. And I can't thank you enough. And God bless, and know that we love you.